Uh, Good afternoon again. Good afternoon again. This is Dr. Scott Smith, and I'm serving in capacity as a research consultant with the Louisiana CARS Project. Again, the Louisiana CARS Project is an assessment tool. A screening tool for evaluating mental health and substance use history and DUI, DWI offenders. Before I get started, let me give my background. My background is educational psychology. I'm a licensed rehabilitation counselor and also a certified life care planner. I'm not a licensed psychologist. I'm not a licensed social worker, but my background is primarily in rehabilitation and also healthcare statistics and transportation statistics. And I've been doing transportation research probably for 10, 15 years. And prior to doing this, I was also a probation officer, and I'm also a mental health professional. And so when I'm looking towards screening in DUI occurrences, I'm looking at it from multiple areas. I'm looking at it from the standpoint of the legal system, which has a dual purpose: one, to promote rehabilitation, but also to recognize responsibility for one's acts. I'm looking at it from a mental health professional standpoint, from a standpoint that oftentimes individuals may not be aware of mental health concerns, mental health statuses, and then it's often it's the DUI themselves that cause people to be aware of their abnormalities. And from the third stance, I'm looking at it from a defendant standpoint. Defendant, whether or not they are guilty, innocent, and independent of the status, there should be a definitive level of respect, understanding, and also education for the defendant. They should be given the opportunity to understand the charges against them. They should be given an opportunity for defending themselves, but also they should be given the opportunity to utilize the judicial system as a means to not only correct their wrong, but also correct their future behavior. There's a responsibility of the judicial system to provide correction, but also look towards recidivism and reduce recidivism. Within the CARS system, it has been discussed that it has multiple utilizations, and there's several things to consider related to DUI screenings. It does represent a valid assessment tool, and this specific discussion is going to talk about when exactly should it be used. Should it used during pre-trial, during trial, post-trial? And again, I'm talking from the standpoint of a mental health professional and someone with a general understanding. I'm not trying to promote certain sentencing guidelines in which I don't have expertise, but rather from a screening perspective, from a mental health perspective, potentially from a concerned citizen standpoint. These are my opinions related to when the CARS screening may be utilized. Again, quick review: the CARS system, again, is a validated computerized tool for assessing mental health and substance use disorders. It provides diagnostic information about 15 different psychiatric disorders. It's been used by the Highway Safety Commission in several parishes. You have to recognize that a high percentage of Louisiana deaths on the highway are related to alcohol-related circumstances. And then also, unfortunately, in Louisiana, most often Louisiana courts only require screening after a third DUI, and oftentimes this is too late, in which you may have not only personal injury, but also you may have property damage, and also obviously responsibility components, and also employment components, personal reputation for the person with multiple DUIs. Potentially, CARS can be used at any stage. I'm going to look towards the pros and cons at 3 stages: 1, pre-trial, at sentencing, and then also at post-sentencing. First, I'll talk about utilizing cars on pretrial. These are some of the pros. If you do it at pretrial, perhaps in PTI, pretrial diversion, pretrial diversion primarily refers to federal courts. PTI refers to the civil courts or the JDCs. Early identification is possible. It can be used to help judges tailor bail or release conditions. It supports diversion to treatment or DUI court. It also enables use of objective data-driven data-driven screening, and it's really intended to be used pre-trial, although it may be used multiple opportunities. Otherwise, it's the primary intention of the assessment at this stage. However, there are some obvious cons. There's always two sides of a coin. There's never one side of a coin. From the negative side of a coin, there are legal and ethical concerns. An individual may be hesitant to indicate the full range of their disability or other mental health because there's a certain level of self-incrimination. It requires voluntary participation. However, if it's required by the court, is it really voluntary? There's high-risk demand sources. Does the court have trained staff to not interpret, but also to administer to make sure there's consistent measurement across defendants? Is there an infrastructure to complete, give the judge the report, give the pretrial officers reports? Is there an infrastructure in place for this to occur? There's also the possibility for a public perception of bias. If you know who I am before going to trial, are you willing to give me an unbiased sentence, an unbiased depiction, an unbiased ruling if you already knew who I am? If there's two people in which a lot of information is known about a person, in another situation, not much information is known about a person, will that information potentially bias the judge, the prosecuting attorneys, or others? There is a possibility that cars will be used at sentencing. In my experience, I've really never seen it used at this stage. However, for the sake of clarity and the sake of sequencing, I'll talk about the pros and cons of this. Again, I've never really seen it used at sentencing. However, I'll have this discussion anyway. From a positive standpoint, it does offer individualized sentencing information based upon actual profiles, actual behaviors. It offers an objective measure for immediate referral to treatment. It could avoid pretrial legal challenges, often used in lieu of PSI or as an add-on, and it may perhaps enhance judge confidence in tailoring conditions for rehab and also supervision, particularly for probation. However, as there's pros, there's also cons. One of the potential cons is sentencing delay may occur while car sentencing is being completed. Most often, there's multiple circumstances where people are on the docket and judges are trying to process many defendants at the same time. There is a possibility of manipulated responses. In other words, individuals may exaggerate or minimize their symptoms based upon perceived perception or need or expectation on behalf of the judge. Particularly considering the high risk involved at sentencing, you may have to transition the CARS administration to trained probation or court staff to interpret and act on the sentence, to act on the findings. And likewise, across this discussion, one thing that has to be considered is consistent use. If there is inconsistent use across parishes or across JDCs, then likewise there may not be consistent interpretation and consistent application. One of the components which I've seen CARs used relatively effectively is post-sentencing. In other words, an individual has already been either tried or admitted, and then it's a sentencing stage. So there's several things I've seen happen from a positive standpoint of utilization of the CAR screening. I've seen it assist probation developing tailored supervised plans. In other words, you can look at the negative components of individuals' behaviors. You can look towards the diagnoses. You can look towards the treatment recommendations. It will perhaps allow for mid-probation adjustments when new issues emerge. I have seen it utilized very well post-sentencing when you have high risk or repeat DUI offenders. It does allow monitoring of behaviors and ensures behavioral needs are addressed even if missed earlier. In other words, an individual may have gone through the whole system regarding pre-sentencing trial, now they're a post-sentencing stage, and an individual still perhaps is having difficulty meeting conditions of probation. And again, a lot of these inability to meet conditions of probation may be related to mental health or even comorbid conditions besides substance abuse. And the CAR system may be utilized beneficially in these circumstances. However, potentially there's several post-sentencing cons. There may be less opportunity for intervention. There may be less prevention window. Motivation to participate on behalf of the defendant may drop. In other words, I've got my sentence, whether or not the sentence is good or bad. I'm doing my sentencing. I don't want to have any other parameters or contingencies. I really don't want to participate, and therefore I'm not going to participate. And then you start going into the legal challenge. Something that also potentially adds to is the probation workload. Probation officers often have a significant caseload, and this adds 20, 30, 40 minutes to each evaluation, to each, not really evaluation, but to each screening for their probationers. It may create an additional problem regarding time management. Oftentimes, court systems may utilize other mental health, not necessarily alcohol, but other mental health screenings. There may be some replication that may be applicable, particularly at this age. And then likewise, if it's done post-sentencing, there's less judicial oversight. I do recognize that probation officers are representative of the judicial system, but they may lack authority to enforce new components without returning to court. Now, one of the things that I recognize is that court systems have their own personalities. They have their own needs. They have their own skills. They have their own abilities. One thing that I always recommend is that related to any kind of mental health screening, any kind of mental health awareness, it needs to be personal, based on the skills, abilities, needs, wants of the individual JDCs. Individual JDCs may determine that it needs to be done at pretrial, at sentencing, post-sentencing. In my personal opinion, the best practice for utilization of the CAR system is at a pre-screening, pre-trial, and then maybe there may be a full CAR that's sentencing and then reassess during a probation. This is a best practices. However, there's a difference between theory and reality. You're looking towards 3 screenings. From a mental health model, you're looking at a pre-treatment, treatment, and then post-treatment measure. I think it would be very valuable to understand the progression of an individual. And from a research standpoint, this represents an optimal condition. But in a practical standpoint, I don't know if this can really be implemented. Something that the pilot program has shown is a viable model. Earlier pretrial, smarter intervention does save life and reduce repeat offenses. Just from a personal opinion, in Louisiana, primarily there's only a requirement that screening be done at third offenses. There's lots of negative components that can happen prior to third offenses. What's the significance of that second DUI? What's the significance of that first DUI? You're looking towards, if somebody has the 3 DUIs, you're looking towards some pretty significant abnormal behaviors, not only related to substance abuse, but related to comorbid condition and comorbid behaviors. You're evaluating, it's like evaluating the tool. Evaluating the strength and rigidity of a tool that's been broken multiple times. Can somebody recover from that DUI? Perhaps. However, the social, the economic, the personal, the court cost is significant. Again, that represents a personal opinion. I recognize it contradicts a lot of the parameters right now within the court system, but that represents a personal opinion. All in all, regarding my general opinion, the key question is, when should the card screening be used? I think the sooner the better. The sooner the better. The court is able to get essential information related to a DUI defendant, and then likewise the judge, the defense attorney, the prosecuting attorney, and also the defendant can get necessary information in order to proceed forward with further court processes, adjudication, sentencing, perhaps rehabilitation. Again, this is Dr. Scott Smith. I'm a research consultant with the Louisiana CARS Project, and this is my opinion related to when in the judicial process should the CARS screening occur. Thank you.